Welcome to St. Mary Mead, where murders hide in plain sight, but Miss Jane Marple sees what no one else does. From a scuffed shoe on a gravel path to a misplaced teacup, a forgotten handkerchief, a loud ticking clock, a disturbed garden path, a forged letter, and a shadow in a mirror, each tiny clue unravels a deadly secret. In 7 gripping mysteries, this sharp-eyed spinster knits together truth from the smallest details, proving no killer can outsmart her. Dive into a cozy village where every whisper hides a crime, and Miss Marple's genius catches them all. Chapter 1. The Unseen Glance. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where cottages lined the lanes like cosy old friends, Miss Jane Marple sat by her window. Her knitting needles clicked like a soft heartbeat, steady and sure. Outside, the world was quiet, but a storm was brewing. Colonel Bantry's big house up on the hill had just seen a terrible crime. A young dancer named Ruby Keene, bright and full of life, was found dead in the library, murdered. The village buzzed with whispers, but Miss Marple stayed calm, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Ruby had come to stay at the Bantry house for a fancy party. She was a guest, all smiles and sparkles, with dreams of dancing on big stages. But now she was gone, her body cold on the library rug. The police thought it was a lover's fight gone wrong. Ruby was pretty, and pretty girls, they said, often stirred up trouble. But Miss Marple didn't buy it. She'd seen too many secrets in St. Mary Mead to believe the easy story. She sipped her tea, her mind turning over one tiny detail nobody else noticed: Ruby's shoes. Those shoes were red shiny, made for dancing. But they were scuffed, not in the way shoes get from twirling on a polished floor. The marks were rough, like they'd been dragged over gravel. Miss Marple knew every path in the village, and only one had gravel like that. The old mill path, hidden by trees where nobody went unless they had something to hide. She didn't say a word about it, not yet. She just kept knitting, letting the village talk while she thought. The Bantry house was a grand place, with tall windows and rooms full of old books and heavy curtains. Colonel Bantry, a kind man with a loud laugh, was shaken. His wife Dolly was Miss Marple's friend, and she'd called her over that morning. "Jane," Dolly said, her voice wobbly, "it's awful. Ruby was so young. Who could do this?" Miss Marple patted her hand and said, There, Dolly. We'll find out." But she was already looking around, her eyes catching things others missed. The library where Ruby died was a mess. Books were on the floor, a vase was tipped over, and a chair was crooked. The police said it looked like a struggle. They found a scarf near Ruby's body, silky and blue, and thought it might belong to the killer. Everyone was talking about a young man named George who danced with Ruby at the party. George was handsome, with dark hair and a quick smile, but he had a temper. The village said he was sweet on Ruby, and maybe he got jealous. Miss Marple listened to the gossip, but didn't join in. She was thinking about those shoes. She asked Dolly to walk her to the mill path later that day. "Just for a stroll," she said, her voice sweet as honey. Dolly, glad for a distraction, agreed. The path was narrow, winding past the old mill, which hadn't turned in years. The gravel crunched under their feet, sharp and grey. Miss Marple stopped and bent down, pretending to fix her shoe. She picked up a tiny stone and slipped it into her pocket. It matched the grit she'd seen on Ruby's shoes. Her heart beat a little faster, but her face stayed calm. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire and thought. The police were busy questioning George. He said he'd left the party early, gone home to his room at the inn. But nobody saw him leave, and his scarf was missing. It sounded bad for him, but Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She knew George from church. He was loud and a bit wild, but not cruel. The scarf in the library felt too neat, like someone wanted the police to find it. And those shoes, nobody was talking about them. The next day, Miss Marple went to the Bantry house again. The police were there, stomping around, asking questions. Inspector Craddock, a young man with a serious face, was leading the case. He was polite to Miss Marple, but he thought she was just a nosy old lady. "Miss Marple," he said, "you should leave this to us." She smiled and nodded, but her eyes were on the floor. She saw a tiny speck of gravel near the library door, the same kind from the mill path. It was so small, nobody else noticed. But to Miss Marple, it was like a shout. She asked Dolly about the party. "Who was with Ruby that night?" she said, her voice soft. Dolly frowned, trying to remember. "Oh, lots of people. George, of course. And that quiet man, Mr. Bartlett, who works at the bank. And Mrs. Jefferson, the rich widow who sponsored Ruby's dancing. Everyone loved Ruby." Miss Marple nodded, but she was thinking about Mr. Bartlett. He was a small man, always nervous with eyes that darted around. She'd seen him near the mill path once, picking blackberries, or so he said. That evening, Miss Marple walked to the village shop. She bought some yarn and chatted with Mrs. Price, who loved to gossip. "Terrible about Ruby," Mrs. Price said, shaking her head. "They say George did it, but I don't know. He's a good boy." Miss Marple smiled and asked, "Did you see anyone near the mill path lately?" Mrs. Price thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, I saw Mr. Bartlett there last week. Said he was looking for his dog, but I didn't see any dog." Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind buzzing. The next morning she visited the church. Mr. Bartlett was there, helping with the flowers. He jumped when he saw her, his hands shaking. Good morning, Miss Marple," he stammered. She smiled and said, "Lovely flowers, Mr. Bartlett. Do you ever walk by the mill path? It's so peaceful." His face went pale, and he mumbled something about being busy. Miss Marple didn't push. She didn't need to. His fear told her enough. What'd shake? At home, she wrote a note to Inspector Craddock. She didn't say much, just suggested he check the mill path for footprints. She signed it "A Friend" and asked her maid to deliver it. The police went to the path that afternoon. They found footprints, deep ones, like someone had carried something heavy. The prints matched Mr. Bartlett's shoes, which he'd tried to clean but hadn't quite managed. When they questioned him, he broke down and confessed. He'd been in love with Ruby, but she laughed at him. In a rage, he'd killed her and dragged her body to the library, hoping to blame George. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village settled down. The police thought they'd solved the case with the footprints, but she knew the real clue was those scuffed shoes. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Justice was done, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again. At least for now, the village of St. Mary Mead was small, with one main street, a church, a shop, and a pub. Everyone knew everyone else's business, or so they thought. But Miss Marple saw things others didn't. She'd lived there her whole life, and she understood people. Their habits, their lies, their fears. She didn't need fancy tools or a badge. Her weapon was her mind, sharp as a needle, and her eyes which caught every detail. Ruby Keane's death was the kind of thing that shook a place like St. Mary Mead. She was only 20, with big dreams and a bigger smile. She'd come to the village to dance at the Bantry party, a grand event with music and wine. The Bantrys were the richest family around, and their parties were the talk of the county. Ruby had worn a red dress that night, spinning across the floor like a flame. Everyone watched her, but someone watched too closely. The library where she died was one of the grandest rooms in the Bantry house. It had tall shelves, a big fireplace, and a rug that cost more than most people's houses. When they found Ruby, she was lying on that rug, her dress crumpled, her face pale. There was a bruise on her neck, and her eyes were open, staring at nothing. The police said she'd been strangled, probably with that blue scarf they found nearby. It was a man's scarf, and George had one just like it. That's why everyone pointed at him. George was 22, a carpenter's son who worked odd jobs. He was charming, with a laugh that made girls blush. He'd danced with Ruby all night, and they'd looked happy, but someone said they heard him arguing with her later, near the garden. George swore it wasn't true. He said he left the party at 10 and went to bed. But the innkeeper couldn't say for sure, and that scarf was hard to explain. The village was ready to call him guilty, but Miss Marple wasn't so quick. She'd known George since he was a boy. He used to climb her apple tree and steal fruit, grinning when she caught him. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't a killer. The scarf felt wrong to her, like a clue left on purpose. And those shoes, nobody else seemed to care about them. They were in the corner of the library, tossed aside, but Miss Marple had seen them when she visited Dolly. The scuffs were deep, with bits of gravel stuck in the leather. She knew right away it wasn't from dancing. The mill path was a place most people forgot. It ran behind the village, past the old mill, which was crumbling and covered in ivy. The path was narrow, with sharp gravel that stuck to your shoes. Nobody used it much, except kids daring each other to explore, or lovers sneaking away. Miss Marple had walked it years ago, before her knees got bad. She remembered the crunch of the gravel, the way it clung to everything. When she saw Ruby's shoes, she knew. Her walk with Dolly was careful. She didn't want to seem nosy, but she needed to check the path. Dolly was too upset to notice Miss Marple's quiet study of the ground. The gravel was the same, and there were marks, faint but there, like something heavy had been dragged. Miss Marple's heart sank, but she kept her face soft, chatting about flowers to keep Dolly calm. The stone she picked up was proof, small but solid. Mr. Bartlett was the key, though she hadn't been sure at first. He was a nobody in the village, a clerk who kept to himself. He went to church, nodded to people, but never stood out. Miss Marple had seen him once by the mill path, his hands full of blackberries, his eyes nervous. She didn't think much of it then, but now it mattered. Mrs. Price's story about the dog that wasn't there sealed it. Bartlett was hiding something. When she saw him at church, she tested him. Her question about the mill path was gentle, but his reaction was loud. His hands shook, his voice cracked. She didn't need more. She wrote the note to Craddock, knowing he'd follow through. The footprints were enough to catch Bartlett, but the shoes were what started it. Miss Marple didn't care about credit. She cared about truth. The village went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. People talked about Ruby for a while, then moved on to other gossip. George went back to work, his name cleared. The Bantrys threw no more parties for a long time, and Miss Marple sat by her window, her needles clicking, watching the world. She knew there'd be more secrets, more clues, and she'd be ready. Chapter 2. The Misplaced Teacup Inn. The quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where gossip spread faster than butter on warm bread. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, like a lullaby, as she watched the world outside her window. The village was still buzzing about Ruby Keane's murder, but a new mystery had crept in. At the vicarage, a big stone house where the vicar and his wife lived, something terrible had happened. Mrs. Clement's cousin, a rich widow named Mrs. Harrow, had died after tea. The doctor said it was her heart, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes saw something nobody else did. A teacup, sitting just a little wrong. Mrs. Harrow was 60, with grey hair and a sharp tongue. She'd come to stay with the Clements for a month, bringing her fancy dresses and a box full of jewels. Everyone knew she was wealthy, and some whispered she was stingy, holding tight to her money. When she collapsed in the vicarage parlour, her face pale and her hands clutching her chest, the village felt sorry, but not surprised. Old ladies died, didn't they? But Miss Marple, who'd seen plenty of deaths in St. Mary Mead, wasn't so sure. She'd been invited for scones the day after, and that's when she noticed the teacup. The vicarage parlour was a warm room, with flowery curtains and a big table covered in a lacy cloth. Mrs. Clement, a kind woman with a nervous smile, had set out tea for Miss Marple and a few others. The tray was neat, with cups lined up like soldiers, their handles all facing the same way, except for one. It was turned inward, its handle pointing toward the tray's centre, like someone had set it down in a hurry. Miss Marple's heart skipped, but her face stayed calm. She sipped her tea and listened to Mrs. Clement talk about her cousin's sudden death. "They say it was her heart," Mrs. Clement said, her eyes red from crying. "She'd been tired lately, but I never thought—" Her voice trailed off. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on that teacup. She knew people got careless when they were scared, or hiding something. Poison, she thought, could make a person nervous enough to misplace a cup, but she didn't say it out loud. Instead, she asked, "Who was here that day, dear?" before she passed. Mrs. Clement thought for a moment. "Just family, mostly. My husband, of course, and Tom, my nephew. He came to see Cousin Eliza, Mrs. Harrow, I mean, and the maid, Sarah, was in and out." Miss Marple smiled and took another sip, but she was thinking about Tom. He was a young man, maybe 25, with slick hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She'd seen him in the village, always talking about big plans, but never with any money to show for it. The next day, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage again. She brought a jar of her homemade jam as an excuse. Mrs. Clement welcomed her in, glad for the company. The parlour looked the same, but the tea tray was gone, put away in the kitchen. Miss Marple didn't ask about it. She sat by the window, her knitting in her lap, and listened as Mrs. Clement talked about the funeral plans. But her eyes wandered to the table where she pictured that teacup. She needed to know more. Was Tom close to Mrs. Harrow? Miss Marple asked, her voice soft as a breeze. Mrs. Clement sighed. Not really. He visited because she was rich, I think. He's always asking for loans, poor boy. Eliza didn't like it, but she gave him a little now and then. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Tom had a motive, she thought. Money made people do ugly things, and Mrs. Harrow's jewels were worth a fortune. That afternoon, Miss Marple went to the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran the place, was sweeping the floor. She loved to talk, and Miss Marple knew how to get her going. Such a shame about Mrs. Harrow, Miss Marple said, picking up a tin of biscuits. Mrs. Price nodded, her broom pausing. Terrible, isn't it? I heard it was her heart, but she seemed fine when I saw her last week. Buying tea she was, and complaining about the price. Miss Marple smiled. Did she have visitors often? Family, maybe? Mrs. Price leaned in, her voice low. That nephew of hers, Tom, was always around. Came in here once, asking if I sold anything for headaches. Said his aunt was fussy about her tea. Funny, though, he didn't buy anything. Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but she kept her face still. Headaches could mean poison, and Tom's interest in tea was no coincidence. She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her mind turning. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire. She pulled out her knitting, but didn't work on it. She was thinking about poison. It wasn't hard to get, not if you knew where to look. The village had a chemist, Mr. Dobbs, who sold medicines and sometimes stronger stuff for rats or weeds. Miss Marple didn't think Tom was bold enough to buy poison outright, but he might have taken something from Mrs. Harrow's own supplies. Rich ladies like her often had bottles of this and that, tucked away in their rooms. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was there, arranging hymnals. He was a gentle man, with glasses that slipped down his nose. "Good to see you, Miss Marple," he said, smiling. "It's been a hard week." She nodded, her eyes kind. "I'm so sorry about your cousin. Did she seem unwell before?" The vicar sighed. She was tired and she had headaches. She kept a bottle of medicine in her room, but she didn't take it often. Miss Marple's heart jumped. Medicine could hide poison, especially if someone was clever. She didn't stay long. She walked home slowly, thinking about the teacup. It was such a small thing, but it told a story. Someone had been nervous, setting it down wrong. Tom was the only one who fit. He'd been at the vicarage that day, lingering by the tea tray, or so Sarah the maid had said. Miss Marple needed to talk to Sarah, but she had to be careful. Servants got scared when you asked too much. That afternoon, Miss Marple baked a batch of scones and took them to the vicarage. Sarah answered the door, her apron smudged with flour. "Oh, Miss Marple, how kind!" she said, taking the basket. Miss Marple smiled. "I thought you might like a treat, dear. It's been a busy week. Were you in the parlour when Mrs. Harrow took ill?" Sarah nodded, her eyes wide. "I was, miss. I brought the tea and Mr. Tom was there, standing by the tray. He looked funny, like he was waiting for something." Miss Marple's heart raced, but she kept her voice soft. "Funny how, dear?" Sarah frowned. He kept touching the cups, like he was checking them. I thought he was just fussy, like his aunt. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her mind spinning. Tom had been by the tray, and he'd been nervous. The teacup was his mistake, a tiny slip that only she'd seen. The next day, Miss Marple went to see Inspector Craddock. He was at the police station, a small building with a creaky door. He was polite but busy, shuffling papers. "Miss Marple," he said, "what brings you here?" She smiled, her hands folded. "Just a thought about Mrs. Harrow. Have you checked her medicine bottle, the one in her room?" Craddock raised an eyebrow. "The doctor said it was her heart." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, but it wouldn't hurt to look, would it?" She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Craddock was young, but he wasn't foolish. He sent a constable to the vicarage that afternoon. They found the bottle, half empty, with traces of something that wasn't medicine. It was poison, the kind used for rats, easy to mix into tea. When they questioned Tom, he tried to lie, saying he'd never touched the bottle. But Sarah's story about the tea tray and the teacup's odd place made him sweat. He confessed by evening, admitting he'd poisoned his aunt for her money. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village settled. The police thought the medicine bottle was the key, but she knew it started with that teacup. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Mrs. Harrow's death was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least until the next secret came along. St. Mary Mead was a place where nothing seemed to happen, but everything did. The vicarage was the heart of it, a place where people came for comfort or gossip. Mrs. Harrow's death was a shock, but not a loud one. Old ladies died, and the village moved on, but Miss Marple didn't. She'd lived too long, seen too much, to believe in simple stories. Her mind was like a net, catching every detail, no matter how small. Mrs. Harrow was the kind of woman who made enemies without trying. She was rich, and she knew it. She wore her jewels like armour, flashing them at church or tea parties. The village respected her, but they didn't like her. Tom, her nephew, was different. He was charming when he wanted to be, but Miss Marple had seen his eyes cold and hungry when he thought nobody was watching. He'd grown up poor, always wanting more, and Mrs. Harrow's money was a prize he couldn't resist. The parlour where she died was a cosy place, but it held secrets. The tea tray was Mrs. Clement's pride, always polished, always perfect. That's why the teacup stood out. Miss Marple knew Mrs. Clement would never set a cup wrong. Someone else had done it. Someone in a rush. Someone scared. Tom was the only one who fit. He'd been there, hovering by the tray, his hands too busy, his smile too tight. Poison was a coward's weapon, but it was easy. The village was full of ways to get it. Rat poison in the shed, weed killer in the garden. Mrs. Harrow's medicine bottle was the perfect hiding place. Tom could have slipped something in, knowing she'd take it or mix it with her tea. The headaches Mrs. Price mentioned were a clue, a sign the poison was working slowly, making her weak. Sarah, the maid, was the key to proving it. She was young, barely 16, with a habit of talking too much. Miss Marple knew how to get her to open up. A kind word, a scone, a gentle question. Sarah's story about Tom and the tea tray was enough to make Craddock listen. The teacup was the spark, but Sarah's words were the fire. Craddock was a good policeman, but he was young. He liked facts, not feelings. Miss Marple didn't mind. She gave him just enough to nudge him along, like a mother guiding a child. The medicine bottle was the proof he needed, but the teacup was what started it. Nobody else saw it, nobody else cared. But to Miss Marple, it was everything. The village mourned Mrs. Harrow, or pretended to. Tom was taken away, his big plans crumbling. Mrs. Clement cried, but she was relieved too. The vicarage went back to its quiet ways, and St. Mary Mead forgot, or tried to. But Miss Marple didn't. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, watching for the next clue, the next secret, the next teacup out of place. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Handkerchief. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where the days moved slow as honey, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cottage by the window. Her knitting needles clicked like a soft song, steady and sure as she watched the world outside. The village was still whispering about Mrs. Harrow's poisoning at the vicarage, but a new trouble had stirred the air. Mr. Truscott, the shopkeeper who sold sweets and newspapers, was dead, murdered in his own shop, his head bashed in. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something nobody else saw. A silk handkerchief, tucked under a shelf, with a tiny L stitched in the corner, said. Truscott was a gruff man, 62, with a beard like a bristle brush. He'd run the village shop for years, always behind the counter, weighing apples or counting coins. Everybody knew him, and most liked him, though he wasn't one for smiles. When they found him, he was slumped by the till, blood on the floor, and the shop in a mess. Jars were smashed, papers scattered, and the money box was empty. The police thought a thief had come in, maybe a stranger passing through, and killed him when he fought back. But Miss Marple didn't believe it. She'd been to the shop the day before, buying yarn, and something felt off even then. The handkerchief was what caught her. She'd gone to the shop the morning after the murder, when the police were still poking around. The place was roped off. But Miss Marple, with her sweet old lady smile, got a peek inside. The floor was a mess, but there, under a shelf near the counter, was a flash of white. It was a silk handkerchief, fine and soft, not the kind Mr. Truscott would own. The L was small, stitched in blue thread. Miss Marple didn't touch it. She just noted it, her heart beating a little faster, and went home to think. The village was buzzing with talk. Everyone had a theory. Some said it was a tramp. Others blamed a boy from the next town who'd been caught stealing once. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, were busy asking questions. They found a heavy wrench near the body, the kind used to fix carts, and thought it was the weapon. It had blood on it and no fingerprints, which made them think the killer was clever. Miss Marple listened to the gossip, but kept quiet. She was thinking about that handkerchief, and who in St. Mary Mead might own one so fine. She remembered seeing Lady Langley at church last Sunday. Lady Langley was a tall woman, 50, with a sharp nose and a way of looking down at everyone. She lived at Langley Manor, a big house on the edge of the village, and she was rich, or so she acted. At church, she'd held a silk handkerchief, dabbing her eyes during the sermon. Miss Marple couldn't see the stitching from her pew, but the cloth looked the same, soft, white, expensive. Her mind turned over the idea, slow and careful, like flipping pages in a book. The next day, Miss Marple walked to the village square. She didn't go to the shop, still closed with a policeman at the door, but to the tea room across the street. Mrs. Baker, who ran it, was a friend and loved to chat. Miss Marple ordered a pot of tea and sat by the window, her knitting in her lap. "Such a shock about Mr. Truscott," she said, her voice soft. Mrs. Baker nodded, wiping her hands on her apron. "Awful, isn't it? I saw him that night, you know, just before he closed up. He was arguing with someone outside." Miss Marple's needles paused just for a second. "Arguing? With who, dear?" Mrs. Baker leaned in, her voice low. Couldn't see clear, but it was a woman. Tall, wearing a fancy hat. Sounded cross. Miss Marple smiled and sipped her tea, but her heart was racing. Lady Langley was tall, and she loved her hats, big ones with feathers. It wasn't proof, but it was a thread, and Miss Marple knew how to pull threads until they unravelled. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire and thought. The handkerchief was the key, but she needed more. Lady Langley wasn't the kind to rob a shop. She had money, or so everyone thought. But Miss Marple knew rich people had secrets too. She'd heard whispers about Langley Manor, about bills, unpaid and servants let go. Maybe Lady Langley wasn't as rich as she seemed. Maybe she needed money, and Mr. Truscott, who kept a tidy sum in his till, was a target. But murder? That was a big leap, and Miss Marple didn't leap without looking. The next morning, she went to church. It wasn't Sunday, but the ladies' group was meeting to plan the spring fair. Lady Langley was there, arranging flowers with a tight smile. Miss Marple joined her, picking up a rose. "Lovely blooms," she said, her voice sweet. "Do you ever shop at Mr. Truscott's, dear? He always had such nice things." Lady Langley's hand froze, just for a moment. Then she laughed a sharp sound. "Oh, I send my maid for errands. I don't go to shops." Miss Marple nodded, but she saw the flicker in Lady Langley's eyes, like a candle in a draught. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited Dolly Bantry, her friend from the big house on the hill. Dolly loved gossip and knew everyone's business. They sat in the garden sipping lemonade, while Miss Marple steered the talk to Lady Langley. "She's so elegant," Miss Marple said, "but I hear she's had troubles lately." Dolly's eyes lit up. "Oh, Jane, you don't know the half of it. Her husband left debts when he died, and she's been selling things to keep up. I heard she even pawned her pearls in London." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. Debts could push a person to do dark things, even someone like Lady Langley. She thanked Dolly and walked home, her mind spinning. The handkerchief, the argument, the debts, it was coming together, but it wasn't enough. She needed to know if Lady Langley had been near the shop that night, and why. The next day Miss Marple went to the post office. Mr. Green, the postmaster, was a quiet man but saw everything. She bought a stamp and chatted about the weather, then said, "Such a pity about Mr. Truscott. Were you here late that night, dear? It must have been so quiet." Mr. Green nodded. "I was locking up around 8. Saw Lady Langley walking by, which was odd. She never comes to the village at night. Looked like she was heading toward the shop." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. Lady Langley at the shop, arguing with Truscott, dropping her handkerchief, It fit, but it wasn't proof. She needed the police to see it, but they were busy chasing the idea of a thief. Inspector Craddock was a good man, but he liked hard facts, not old ladies' hunches. Miss Marple knew she had to nudge him, gentle as a breeze, so he'd find the truth himself. That evening she wrote a note. It was short, just a few lines, suggesting the police check Langley Manor's alibis and look under the shop shelves. She signed it "A Friend" and asked her maid to deliver it to the station. The next morning, Craddock sent a constable to the shop. They found the handkerchief just where Miss Marple had seen it. The L was clear, and when they took it to Langley Manor, the maid confirmed it was Lady Langley's. She'd lost one recently, she said, but didn't know how it got to the shop. Craddock questioned Lady Langley that afternoon. She was haughty at first, saying she'd never been near the shop, but when they showed her the handkerchief and asked about her walk that night, she faltered. The constable had found something else, a pawn ticket in her desk, for jewels sold the day after Truscott's death. The money matched what was taken from the till. Lady Langley broke down, admitting she'd gone to the shop to beg Truscott for a loan. He refused, laughing at her, and in a rage she'd grabbed the wrench and hit him. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village settled. The police thought the pawn ticket was the key, but she knew it started with that handkerchief. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Mr. Truscott's murder was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least for now. St. Mary Mead was a place where secrets hid in plain sight. The shop was the heart of the village, a place where everyone went for bread or gossip. Mr. Truscott was a fixture like the church or the pub, and his death shook people. They wanted a simple answer, a thief, a stranger, someone to blame and forget. But Miss Marple knew life wasn't that neat. She'd lived too long, seen too much, to believe in easy stories. Lady Langley was the kind of woman who seemed above it all. She walked with her head high, her dresses crisp, her voice sharp. But Miss Marple knew pride could hide pain, and money could hide trouble. The whispers about debts, the pawned pearls, the empty manor. It painted a picture. Lady Langley was desperate, and desperate people did desperate things. The handkerchief was her mistake, a tiny slip that only Miss Marple noticed. The shop was a mess when they found Truscott, but it wasn't random. The smashed jars, the scattered papers, it looked like a robbery, but it felt staged. Miss Marple had seen the shop the day before, tidy as always. A real thief wouldn't waste time breaking things. They'd grab the money and run. The wrench was another clue, left too neatly, like it was meant to be found. It was all too perfect, and Miss Marple didn't trust perfect. Mrs. Baker's story about the argument was a spark. A tall woman, a fancy hat, a cross voice, it pointed to Lady Langley, but it wasn't enough. Mr. Green's sighting of her near the shop at night was better, but still not proof. The handkerchief tied it together, a piece of her life left behind in a moment of panic. Miss Marple knew it wasn't robbery that drove her, but shame, anger, and fear. Craddock was a good policeman, but he needed a push. The note was her way of helping without stepping into the light. She didn't care about credit, only justice. The handkerchief led to the pawn ticket, and the pawn ticket led to the truth. Lady Langley's world of pride and secrets came crashing down, and Mr. Truscott's Death was no longer a mystery. The village mourned, then moved on. The shop reopened, with Truscott's nephew behind the counter. Lady Langley was gone, her manor empty. St. Mary Mead went back to its quiet ways, but Miss Marple stayed watchful. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, ready for the next clue, the next secret, the next forgotten handkerchief. Chapter 4. The Clock That Ticked Too Loud. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where the days drifted like leaves on a pond, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm as she gazed out her window. The village was still reeling from Mr. Truscott's murder in the shop, but a new shadow had fallen. Old Mr. Enderby, a quiet man who lived alone in a big house, was dead. Bludgeoned in his study, his body found by the maid. The police thought it was a burglar, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something nobody else noticed. The clock on, the mantle ticking too loud, wound so tight it screamed of a lie. Mr. Enderby was 70, with thin hair and a limp from an old war wound. He kept to himself, reading books and tending his roses. His house was grand but faded, with creaky floors and dusty curtains. When the maid found him, he was slumped in his chair, blood on his head, a heavy candlestick on the floor. The clock on the mantel was stopped at 10:15, and the police said that's when he died. They thought a thief had come in, looking for money, and killed him when he fought back. But Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She'd visited Mr. Enderby a week before, bringing jam, and that clock had bothered her even then. The clock was old, with a brass face and a loud tick. During her visit it had sounded wrong, too sharp, like it was straining. She'd mentioned it to Mr. Enderby, and he'd laughed, saying his nephew, Philip, had wound it too tight. Philip was a young man, 30, with a slick smile and restless hands. He lived in the next town, but visited often, always asking his uncle for money. Miss Marple hadn't thought much of the clock then, but now, with Mr. Enderby dead, it was a clue. A clock wound too tight could be stopped on purpose, to trick people about the time of death. The village was buzzing with talk. Everyone had a story. Some said a stranger had been seen near the house. Others blamed a gardener who'd been fired. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, were busy searching the house. They found a window forced open in the back, and footprints in the mud, outside, big and deep. It looked like a burglary, but Miss Marple's mind was on that clock. She needed to see the study again, to be sure. The next day she visited Mrs. Bantry, her friend who lived in the big house on the hill. Mrs. Bantry was close to Mr. Enderby's maid, Ellen, and could get Miss Marple into the house. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, sipping tea in the garden, "could you ask Ellen if I might see Mr. Enderby's study? I'd like to pay my respects." Mrs. Bantry, always eager to help, agreed. That afternoon they went to the house, where Ellen let them in, her eyes red from crying. The study was dark, with heavy bookshelves and a big desk. The candlestick was gone, taken by the police, but the clock was still on the mantel. Miss Marple stood near it, pretending to admire a photo of Mr. Enderby. The clock was ticking again, but it was still loud, too tight. She leaned closer and saw the key, used to wind it, sitting on the mantel. It was shiny, like it had been handled recently. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. She thanked Ellen and left, her mind spinning. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire. She didn't knit, just thought. The stopped clock at 10:15 was too neat. A burglar wouldn't stop to wind a clock, let alone break it. But someone who wanted to fake the time of death might. Philip was the only one who fit. She'd seen him in the village a month ago, fiddling with a pocket watch, winding it too hard until it snapped. He had a habit, a nervous one, and Mr. Enderby had mentioned it with the clock. Philip had been in the house often, and he needed money. His uncle's will, she'd heard, left everything to him. The next morning, Miss Marple went to the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran it, was sweeping the floor. "Such a shame about Mr. Enderby," Miss Marple said, picking up a tin of tea. Mrs. Price nodded. "Terrible. I saw his nephew Philip in here the day before it happened. He was buying candles, said his uncle's house was dark." Miss Marple smiled, but her heart jumped. Candles could mean the candlestick, and Philip being there the day before was no coincidence. She needed more. She walked to the post office, where Mr. Green was sorting letters. He was quiet, but saw everything. "Good morning, Mr. Green," she said, buying a stamp. "Did you see anyone near Mr. Enderby's house lately? It's so sad." Mr. Green thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, I saw Philip there 2 nights before the murder. He was leaving late, looked in a hurry." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. Philip had been at the house, and he'd lied about being away. That afternoon, she visited the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was arranging hymnals. "A terrible loss, Mr. Enderby," she said, her voice soft. "Did Philip ever mention his uncle's health?" The vicar sighed. "He did once. Said the old man was stubborn, wouldn't see a doctor. Philip seemed worried, but I thought it was odd. He never seemed close to him." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking in her bag. Philip's worry felt fake, like a mask. Back home, she thought about the clock. It was the key, but she needed to connect it to Philip. The police were focused on the footprints and the window, thinking of a stranger. But Miss Marple knew the truth was closer to home. She remembered something Ellen had said about Philip visiting the day before the murder, saying he'd fixed the clock. That was it. He'd wound it tight, stopped it at 10:15, to make it look like he was gone when his uncle died. But Mr. Enderby had been alive later. She'd seen a light in his study at 11 hours. When she walked by that night, the next day she went to the tea room. Mrs. Baker, who ran it, was wiping tables. "Such a shock about Mr. Enderby," Miss Marple said, ordering tea. "Did you see anything that night?" Mrs. Baker nodded. "I was closing up around 10. Saw Philip walking away from the house, carrying a bag. Thought it was odd, him leaving so late." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart racing. Philip had been there, and the clock was a lie. She needed to nudge the police, but carefully. Inspector Craddock was smart, but he didn't trust old ladies' stories. That evening, she wrote a note, short and simple, suggesting they check Philip's alibi and the clock's winding key for fingerprints. She signed it "A Friend" and asked her maid to deliver it. The next morning, Craddock sent a constable to the house. They tested the key and found Philip's prints clear as day. When they questioned him, he said he'd wound the clock days before, but the key was too clean, like it had been used recently. Craddock went to Philip's lodging in the next town. They found a bag hidden under his bed, with Mr. Enderby's watch and some money from the house. Philip's alibi fell apart. He'd said he was at a pub, but nobody saw him there after 9. When they pressed him, he confessed. He'd fought with his uncle about money, grabbed the candlestick in a rage, and killed him. He'd stopped the clock to make it look like he was gone, but he'd wound it too tight, just like always. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village calmed. The police thought the fingerprints were the key, but she knew it was that loud clock. Inez didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Mr. Enderby's murder was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least until the next secret came along. St. Mary Mead was a place where time moved slow, but secrets moved fast. Mr. Enderby's house was like him, old, quiet, full of stories nobody knew. His death was a shock, but not a loud one. Old men died, and the village sighed and moved on. But Miss Marple didn't. She'd seen too many lies, too many clues, to believe in simple tales. Philip was the kind of man who smiled too much. He was charming, but his eyes were hungry, always looking for a way to get ahead. Mr. Enderby's money was his dream, and dreams could turn dark. Miss Marple had seen him in the village, always rushing, always talking about plans that never happened. The clock was his mistake, a habit he couldn't hide. She'd noticed it before, with his watch, and Mr. Enderby had mentioned it too. It was a small thing, but small things mattered. The study was a perfect stage for murder. The forced window, the footprints. It looked like a burglary, but it felt wrong. A real thief wouldn't bother with a clock, wouldn't leave a candlestick in plain sight. It was all too tidy, like a play. Miss Marple knew Philip had been there, setting the scene, trying to outsmart everyone. But he didn't count on her. Mrs. Baker's story about seeing him leave, Mr. Green's sighting of him days before, the vicar's comment about his fake worry. It all fit. The clock was the spark, but the village's eyes were the fuel. Miss Marple knew how to listen, how to ask without asking. People talked to her, not because she pushed, but because she was kind, quiet, like a grandmother they trusted. Craddock was a good policeman, but he needed help. The note was her way of guiding him, like a hand on a child's shoulder. She didn't want fame, just truth. The fingerprints on the key, the bag under Philip's bed, the holes in his alibi. It all came from that clock, ticking too loud, telling a lie she couldn't ignore. The village mourned Mr. Enderby, then forgot. His house stood empty, the roses untended. Philip was gone, locked away, his dreams dust. St. Mary Mead went back to its sleepy ways, but Miss Marple stayed watchful. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, waiting for the next clue, the next secret, the next clock that ticked too loud. Chapter 5. The Garden Path's Secret. In the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, where roses bloomed and secrets whispered, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage. Her knitting needles clicked like a gentle heartbeat, steady and soft as she watched the world through her window. The village was still shaken by Mr. Enderby's murder, but a new tragedy had struck. Miss Lavinia, a quiet spinster who lived alone, was found dead in her garden. Strangled, her body lay among the flowers. The police blamed a vagrant seen nearby, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something nobody else saw. The gravel path, disturbed in a way that told a darker story. Miss Lavinia was 65, small and frail, with hair like silver thread. She lived in a tidy cottage, surrounded by a garden she loved. She grew roses and lavender, and her days were spent weeding or reading by the window. Everyone in St. Mary Mead knew her. A kind soul who gave children sweets and never raised her voice. When her neighbour found her sprawled on the garden path, a scarf tight around her neck, the village gasped. Who could hurt someone so gentle? The police, led by Inspector Craddock, thought it was a drifter, a rough man seen begging near the church. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She'd walked by Lavinia's garden the day before, and something about the path stuck in her mind. The garden path was narrow, made of grey gravel that crunched underfoot. It wound from the cottage to the gate, bordered by flowers. When Miss Marple heard about the murder, she pictured that path. She'd noticed it looked odd the day before. The gravel stirred up, not smooth like Lavinia kept it. After the murder, she went to see for herself, using a visit to her friend Dolly Bantry as an excuse. Dolly lived nearby, and they walked to Lavinia's cottage together, saying they wanted to leave flowers. The police were there, but Miss Marple's eyes went straight to the path. The gravel was disturbed, not just where Lavinia lay, but farther back, with two sets of marks. One light, one heavy, like someone had carried something. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. The village was full of talk. Everyone felt sorry for Lavinia, and most believed the vagrant story. The drifter, a man named Jack, had been seen near the church asking for food. He looked scruffy, with a torn coat, and people said he seemed angry when turned away. The police had him in custody, but he swore he'd never gone near Lavinia's cottage. Miss Marple listened to the gossip, but didn't join in. She was thinking about those marks on the path. They weren't random. Someone had carried Lavinia, maybe after she was already dead, and the heavy prints didn't match Jack's worn boots. She remembered Lavinia's gardener, a young man named Harry. He was 25, strong, with rough hands and a quiet way. He came twice a week to mow the lawn and trim the hedges. Miss Marple had seen him in the village, carrying tools, his boots caked with mud. She'd also heard Lavinia mention him once, saying he was good but pushy, always asking about her savings. Lavinia had money, not much, but enough to tempt someone desperate. Miss Marple's mind turned over the idea, slow and careful, like sifting flour. The next day, she visited Dolly Bantry again. They sat in Dolly's sunny parlour, sipping tea. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "did Lavinia ever talk about her gardener?" Dolly frowned, thinking. "Harry? Oh, yes. She said he was helpful but nosy. Kept asking if she had a will, which she thought was odd." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Harry had a motive, and those heavy prints could be his. She needed to see the garden again to be sure. That afternoon she walked to Lavinia's cottage. The police were gone, but a neighbour, Mrs. Hill, was there tending the flowers. Miss Marple smiled and said, "Such a lovely garden. Did Harry help with the path too?" Mrs. Hill shook her head. "No, Miss Lavinia did that herself. Kept it neat as a pin. Funny, though, it's all messed up now." Miss Marple bent down, pretending to admire a rose, and studied the gravel. The heavy prints were deep, with a pattern like work boots. Her heart jumped, but she kept her face still. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire and thought. The path was the key. A vagrant wouldn't carry a body. He'd run. But someone who knew the cottage, someone who worked there, might. Harry was strong enough to carry Lavinia, and his boots could make those marks. She remembered something else. Lavinia's scarf, the one used to strangle her, was her own, kept on a hook by the door. A stranger wouldn't know where to find it, but Harry would, coming in and out each week. The next morning, she went to the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran it, was stacking cans. "So sad about Miss Lavinia," Miss Marple said, picking up a jar of jam. Mrs. Price nodded. "Awful. I saw Harry in here the day before buying rope. Said he needed it for the garden, but it seemed strange." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but she smiled. Rope could mean planning, and Harry's story didn't add up. She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her mind buzzing. She needed more. She walked to the post office, where Mr. Green was sorting mail. "Good morning," she said, buying a stamp. "Did you see Harry near Lavinia's cottage lately?" Mr. Green thought for a moment. "Come to think of it, I saw him there the night before she died late. He was by the gate, looking around." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home, her mind spinning. Harry had been there, and the path's marks were no accident. That afternoon she visited the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was polishing the brass. "Such a loss, Miss Lavinia," she said, her voice gentle. "Did Harry ever talk about her?" The vicar sighed. "Once. He said she was kind but stubborn, keeping her money in a tin instead of a bank. I thought he sounded bitter." Miss Marple nodded, her needles in her bag. Harry's bitterness was a clue, and the tin of money was a prize. Back home, she thought about the path. The police were focused on Jack, the vagrant, because he was easy to blame. But the gravel told a different story. Harry knew the cottage, the scarf, the tin. He'd been there late, seen by Mr. Green, and his boots matched the prints. Miss Marple remembered something Dolly had said. Lavinia's tin was missing, found empty in the shed. Harry must have taken it, thinking he'd get away clean. But the path was his mistake, a clue only she saw. The next day she went to the tea room. Mrs. Baker, who ran it, was wiping tables. "Terrible about Miss Lavinia," Miss Marple said, ordering tea. "Did you see Harry that day?" Mrs. Baker nodded. "He was in here, morning of the murder, looking nervous. Paid with a shilling, but it was shiny, like from a special stash." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart racing. A shiny shilling could be from Lavinia's tin, and Harry's nerves were a sign. She needed to guide the police, but softly. Inspector Craddock was thorough, but he trusted evidence, not hunches. That evening she wrote a note, short and clear, suggesting they check the garden path for boot prints and ask about Harry's whereabouts. She signed it "A Friend" and asked her maid to deliver it. The next morning, Craddock sent a constable to the cottage. They measured the prints and found they matched Harry's work boots, which he'd tried to scrub clean. When they searched his room, they found Lavinia's tin, hidden under a floorboard, with a few coins left. Craddock questioned Harry that afternoon. He denied everything at first, saying he was home that night. But Mr. Green's sighting and the shiny shilling broke him. He confessed, admitting he'd strangled Lavinia with her scarf, hoping to steal her money. He'd carried her to the path to make it look like an attack, but the gravel betrayed him. The police let Jack go, and the village sighed with relief, though they were stunned about Harry. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village settled. The police thought the tin was the key, but she knew it was that disturbed path. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Miss Lavinia's murder was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least until the next secret bloomed. St. Mary Mead was a place where beauty hid shadows. Lavinia's cottage was a jewel, its garden a burst of colour that drew every eye. Her death was a wound, cutting deep into the village's heart. People wanted a villain they could hate, like Jack, the vagrant, who looked the part. But Miss Marple knew truth was trickier, hiding in plain sight, like gravel stirred by guilty feet. Harry was a man of few words, but his hands told a story. They were strong, calloused, made for work. He'd been kind to Lavinia, or so it seemed, but Miss Marple had seen his eyes, sharp when he thought nobody watched. Money was his weakness, and Lavinia's tin was a temptation too big to ignore. The path was his slip, a mark he couldn't erase, no matter how he tried. The garden was a perfect stage for murder. The scarf, the tin, the quiet night, it was planned, not random. A vagrant wouldn't know where Lavinia kept her scarf, wouldn't carry her body to stage a scene. But Harry knew every inch of that cottage, every habit of its owner. The path's marks were his signature, written in gravel, clear to Miss Marple's eyes. Mrs. Price's story about the rope, Mr. Green's sighting, the vicar's hint of bitterness. It all built the case. Miss Marple knew how to listen, how to nudge people into talking. She was soft, like a breeze, but her questions were sharp, cutting to the truth. The village trusted her, not because she demanded, but because she cared, or seemed to. Craddock was a good policeman, but he needed a spark. The note was her way of lighting it without taking the stage. She didn't want praise, just justice. The boot prints, the tin, the shilling, it all came from that path, disturbed by a killer who thought he was clever. But nobody was cleverer than Miss Marple, not when it came to secrets. The village mourned Lavinia, then healed. Her cottage stood empty, the garden untended. Harry was gone, locked away, his greed his ruin. St. Mary Mead went back to its gentle rhythm, but Miss Marple stayed watchful. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, ready for the next clue, the next secret, the next mark on a garden path. Chapter 6. The Letter That Wasn't Sent In. The gentle village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets bloomed like weeds. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a quiet song, as she watched the world through her window. The village was still shaken by Miss Lavinia's murder in her garden, but a new sorrow had struck. Clara, a young heiress with bright eyes and big dreams, was found drowned in the village pond. The police called it suicide, pointing to a love letter found in her room. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something nobody else saw. The letter's ink, too fresh, its edges too crisp, like it was written to fool everyone. Clara was 22, with golden hair and a laugh that lit up rooms. She'd inherited money from her father, a merchant who died years ago, and lived with her aunt, Mrs. Reed, in a pretty cottage by the church. Clara was kind, always helping at the village fair or reading to children. When they found her, in the pond, her dress soaked and her face pale, the village wept. A letter was on her desk, written in her hand, saying she couldn't live without her love, a young man named Robert. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, thought she'd taken her own life after a broken heart, but Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She'd visited Mrs. Reed the day after, bringing scones, and saw the letter. Something about it felt wrong. The letter was on Clara's desk, in a neat envelope. The police showed it to Mrs. Reed, who cried, saying Clara had been upset about Robert. But Miss Marple, sipping tea in the parlour, noticed the ink. It was dark, shiny, not faded like Clara's other notes, which were creased and worn. This letter looked new, its edges sharp, like it had been written hours before, not days or weeks. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. A forged letter could mean murder, and Miss Marple knew who to watch. Robert, the man Clara loved, who'd been seen arguing with her the night before she died. The village was buzzing with pity. Everyone knew Clara and Robert were sweet on each other. Robert was 24, a blacksmith's son, strong and handsome, with a quick temper. They'd been seen walking by the pond, laughing, but lately there'd been fights. Some said Clara wanted to marry, but Robert wasn't ready. Others whispered he was jealous, thinking Clara's money drew other men. The letter seemed to seal it. She'd died for love. But Miss Marple didn't believe in easy stories. She'd seen Robert in the village, his eyes hard, and she'd seen Clara's notes before, always folded, never pristine. The next day Miss Marple visited Mrs. Reed. Again they sat in the parlour, the letter still on the desk, now in a police bag. "Such a tragedy," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "Did Clara write a lot of letters?" Mrs. Reed nodded, wiping her eyes. "Oh, yes. She was always scribbling to Robert, little notes she'd fold and keep. She loved him so." Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was on the letter's edges. Clara's notes were messy, loved, not perfect like this one. She asked, "Was Robert here often, dear?" Mrs. Reed sighed. "Almost every day. They argued, sometimes, but I thought they'd work it out." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but she kept her face still. Robert had access to Clara's desk, her ink, her paper. He could have written the letter, copying her hand, to cover something darker. She needed to know more about him. That afternoon she walked to the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran it, was dusting shelves. "So sad about Clara," Miss Marple said, picking up a tin of biscuits. Mrs. Price nodded. "Heartbreaking. I saw Robert in here the day before, buying ink. Said he was writing a letter, but he looked angry." Miss Marple's heart beat faster, but she smiled. Ink was a clue, and Robert's anger was a spark. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire and thought. The letter was the key. A real suicide note would be worn, tear-stained, like Clara's other letters. This one was too clean, like a lie. Robert had been at the cottage, arguing with Clara, buying ink. She remembered something else. Mrs. Reed had said Clara was happy that morning, planning to visit the fair. Happy girls didn't drown themselves. Miss Marple's mind turned over the idea, slow and careful, like kneading dough. The next morning, she went to the post office. Mr. Green, the postmaster, was sorting letters. "Good morning," she said, buying a stamp. "Did you see Clara or Robert near the pond lately?" Mr. Green thought for a moment. "I saw them there the night before she died, arguing. Robert looked mad and Clara was crying." Miss Marple thanked him and left, her mind buzzing. An argument by the pond, ink in Robert's hand. A perfect letter. It was coming together, but she needed more. That afternoon she visited the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was arranging hymnals. "Such a loss, Clara," she said, her voice gentle. "Did Robert ever talk about her?" The vicar sighed. "Once. He said she was too good for him, but he sounded bitter, like her money was a problem." Miss Marple nodded, her needles in her bag. Robert's bitterness was a clue, and Clara's money was a motive. She'd heard whispers that Robert wanted to start a business, but Clara wouldn't give him her savings. Back home, she thought about the letter. Forging it was clever, but not perfect. The ink was too fresh, the edges too sharp. Robert knew Clara's handwriting. He'd seen her notes. He could have written it after killing her, to make it look like suicide. The pond was deep, and a strong man like Robert could hold her under. Miss Marple remembered something Mrs. Reed had said. Clara's shoes were muddy, like she'd been by the pond before she died. But the letter said she'd written it at home, not outside. The next day she went to the tea room. Mrs. Baker, who ran it, was wiping tables. "Terrible about Clara," Miss Marple said, ordering tea. "Did you see Robert that day?" Mrs. Baker nodded. "He was in here, morning of the murder, looking shaky. Paid with a coin, but his hands were trembling." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart racing. Trembling hands meant guilt, and Robert's presence was no coincidence. She needed to nudge the police, but gently. Inspector Craddock was thorough, but he trusted facts, not feelings. That evening she wrote a note, short and clear, suggesting they check the letter's ink and Robert's alibi for the night Clara died. She signed it "A Friend" and asked her maid to deliver it. The next morning, Craddock sent a constable to the cottage. They tested the ink and found it was new, bought from the shop, not the kind Clara used. When they checked Robert's alibi, he said he was home, but nobody saw him after his fight with Clara. Craddock questioned Robert that afternoon. He denied everything, saying he loved Clara and would never hurt her. But the ink matched the bottle he'd bought, and his boots had. Mud from the pond. They found a scrap of paper in his room, with Clara's handwriting copied, like he'd practiced. Robert broke down, admitting he'd fought with Clara about money. She'd refused to give him her savings, and in a rage he'd pushed her into the pond, holding her down. He'd written the letter to cover it, thinking it would fool everyone. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village calmed. The police thought the ink was the key, but she knew it was that crisp letter. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Clara's murder was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least until the next secret surfaced. St. Mary Mead was a place where love and lies grew side by side. Clara's cottage was a haven, full of light and laughter, until it wasn't. Her death was a tragedy, the kind that broke hearts and fueled gossip. The village wanted to believe in suicide, a sad but simple story. But Miss Marple knew truth. was messier, hiding in details like fresh ink and sharp edges. Robert was a man of charm and fire. He was strong, with hands that could shape iron, but his temper was his weakness. Clara's money was his dream, a way out of the village, but she held it tight. Miss Marple had seen him in the square, his smile tight when Clara wasn't looking. The letter was his trick, a desperate move to hide his crime. But he didn't know Clara's habits, didn't know her notes were loved, not perfect. The pond was a quiet place, perfect for a murder. It was deep, hidden by reeds, and nobody walked there at night. Robert could have taken Clara there after their fight, knowing she'd follow. The letter was his shield, meant to close the case before it opened. But the ink betrayed him too, new, too clean, like his lie. Mrs. Price's story about the ink, Mr. Green's sighting of the fight, the vicar's hint of bitterness. It all built the truth. Miss Marple knew how to listen, how to ask without pushing. She was gentle, like a grandmother, but her questions were knives cutting through stories to find facts. The village trusted her, not because she demanded, but because she seemed to care. Craddock was a good policeman, but he needed a nudge. The note was her way of pointing him to the truth, without stealing the light. She didn't want credit, just justice. The ink, the mud, the practice paper. It all came from that letter, a lie she saw through from the start. The village mourned Clara, then moved on. Her cottage stood empty, the flowers fading. Robert was gone, locked away, his dreams drowned with Clara. St. Mary Mead went back to its soft rhythm, but Miss Marple stayed watchful. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, ready for the next clue, the next secret, the next letter that wasn't sent. Chapter 7. The Shadow in the Mirror. In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, where secrets hid like mice in the walls, Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a gentle hum, as she watched the world through her window. The village was still reeling from Clara's drowning, but a new tragedy had struck. Miss Vane, a visiting actress with a bright smile, was stabbed at the village fete. The police suspected a jealous rival, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something nobody else saw. A shadow in a mirror, fleeting but real, moving behind Miss Vane just before her scream. Miss Vane was 30, with dark hair and a voice like music. She'd come to St. Mary Mead for the fete, a big event with stalls, games and a play she starred in. The village loved her, clapping loud as she performed on the makeshift stage. But during the fete, in the crowded hall where tea was served, she'd screamed and fallen, a knife in her side. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, thought it was another actress, Miss Lyle, who'd been snappy with Vane all week. But Miss Marple, sitting in her usual corner with her knitting, had seen something different. In a mirror on the hall wall, just before the scream, a shadow moved, quick and sneaky, behind Vane. It wasn't Miss Lyle. The hall was packed that day, with villagers laughing and eating scones. The mirror hung near the back staircase, a narrow path to the upstairs rooms. Miss Marple had been sipping tea, her eyes wandering when she saw the shadow. It was tall, thin, and gone in a flash, but it stuck in her mind like a burr. When Vane fell, the crowd gasped, and the police rushed in, but Miss Marple stayed calm, her needles clicking. She knew the shadow was a clue, one nobody else noticed. The village buzzed with talk. Everyone loved Miss Vane, but some said she had enemies. Miss Lyle, a blonde actress with a sharp tongue, had argued with her over the play's lead role. They'd been heard shouting backstage, and Lyle had a temper. The police found a scarf near Vane's body, one Lyle wore, and thought it was proof, but Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She'd seen Lyle in the crowd, far from the staircase, when Vane screamed. The shadow was someone else, someone who knew the hall's back ways. She remembered a stagehand, Tom, who'd worked on the Fates play. He was 28, lanky, with quiet eyes and a habit of staying out of sight. Miss Marple had seen him fixing lights, always near Vane, watching her more than he should. She'd heard a rumour, too, from Mrs. Bantry, that Tom had a grudge against Vane, something about a job she'd cost him in London. Miss Marple's mind turned over the idea, slow and careful, like folding a quilt. The next day she visited Mrs. Bantry, her friend who'd helped organise the fete. They sat in the garden, sipping lemonade. "Dolly," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, "did Tom seem upset with Miss Vane?" Dolly frowned, thinking, "Now that you mention it, he was odd. Snapped at her once during rehearsal, said she'd ruined him. I thought he was just tired." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. Tom's grudge was a motive, and his thin frame could match the shadow. She needed to see the hall again. That afternoon, she walked to the village hall. The fete was over, but the stage was still up, and a few volunteers were cleaning. Miss Marple smiled and said, "Such a lovely event, despite the sadness. May I look around?" The volunteers nodded, and she wandered to the mirror. It was old, with a heavy frame, reflecting the staircase behind. She pictured the shadow, moving fast, and noticed the staircase door was hidden, perfect for someone sneaking. Her heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. Back at her cottage, she sat by the fire and thought. The shadow was the key. Miss Lyle was loud, not sneaky, and her scarf felt like a trick, left to point fingers. Tom knew the hall, its stairs, its secrets. He'd been there all day, moving props, unseen by most. Miss Marple remembered something else. Vane's knife wound was clean, like a stagehand's tool, not a kitchen blade. Tom carried a small knife for cutting rope, and she'd seen it on his belt. The next morning she went to the village shop. Mrs. Price, who ran it, was stacking jars. "So awful about Miss Vane," Miss Marple said, picking up a tin of tea. Mrs. Price nodded. "Terrible. I saw Tom in here the day before, buying a sharpening stone. Said his knife was dull." Miss Marple's heart jumped, but she smiled. A sharp knife was a clue, and Tom's purchase was no accident. She thanked Mrs. Price and left, her mind buzzing. She needed more. She walked to the post office, where Mr. Green was sorting mail. "Good morning," she said, buying a stamp. "Did you see Tom at the fete?" Mr. Green thought for a moment. "I did, near the hall's back door, just before the scream. He looked nervous, like he was waiting." Miss Marple thanked him and walked home, her mind spinning. Tom by the staircase, sharpening his knife, holding a grudge. It fit, but she needed proof. That afternoon she visited the church. The vicar, Mr. Clement, was polishing brass. "Such a shock, Miss Vane," she said, her voice gentle. "Did Tom ever mention her?" The vicar sighed. Once, he said she'd got him fired from a theatre job, called her cruel. I thought he was just venting. Miss Marple nodded, her needles in her bag. Tom's anger was a spark, and the shadow was the flame. Back home, she thought about the mirror. The police were focused on Miss Lyle, her scarf, her temper. But the shadow told a different story. Tom knew the staircase, the hall's layout. He could have slipped behind Vane, stabbed her, and vanished in the chaos. The scarf was a distraction, like a prop in a play. Miss Marple remembered something Mrs. Bantry had said. Tom had been seen wiping his hands after the scream, like they were dirty. Blood could do that, even if he tried to clean it. The next day she went to the tea room. Mrs. Baker, who ran it, was wiping tables. Terrible about Miss Vane, Miss Marple said, ordering tea. Did you see Tom at the fete? Mrs. Baker nodded. He was by the staircase door, right before it happened. Looked pale, kept looking at his knife. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her heart racing. Tom's knife, his place by the stairs, it was all there, clear as day. She needed to guide the police, but softly. Inspector Craddock was smart, but he liked evidence, not stories. That evening she wrote a note, short and clear, suggesting they check the back staircase for traces of blood and ask about Tom's knife. She signed it, "A Friend," and asked her maid to deliver it. The next morning, Craddock sent a constable to the hall. They found a drop of blood on the staircase, missed in the rush, and it matched Vane's. When they searched Tom's bag, they found his knife, cleaned but with a nick that matched the wound. Craddock questioned Tom that afternoon. He denied everything, saying he'd been moving props, not near Vane. But the blood, the knife, and Mr. Green's sighting broke him. He confessed, admitting he'd hated Vane for ruining his career. He'd waited by the staircase, stabbed her in a flash, and slipped away, dropping Lyle's scarf to shift blame. The police cleared Miss Lyle, and the village sighed, stunned by the truth. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting as the village settled. The police thought the blood was the key, but she knew it was that shadow in the mirror. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't need to. Miss Vane's murder was solved, and St. Mary Mead was quiet again, at least until the next secret stirred. St. Mary Mead was a place where joy and sorrow danced close. The fete was a burst of life, with music and laughter, but death had slipped in, quiet as a shadow. Miss Vane's murder was a shock, the kind that hushed voices and fueled whispers. The village wanted a villain they could name, like Miss Lyle, whose jealousy was loud, but Miss Marple knew truth hid in corners, in fleeting shapes nobody else saw. Tom was a man of shadows, always there but never noticed. He was quick, with hands that knew tools, but his heart held anger. Miss Vane's success was his failure, a wound he couldn't forgive. The mirror was his mistake, catching his shape when he thought he was safe. Miss Marple had seen him, not with her eyes, but with her mind, piecing together his grudge, his knife, his quiet steps. The hall was a perfect stage for murder. The crowd, the noise, the hidden staircase. It was made for a quick crime. Tom knew every inch, every door, like a script he'd memorized. The scarf was his trick, a prop to point at Lyle, but the shadow was his undoing, a clue only Miss Marple caught. Mrs. Price's story about the sharpening stone, Mr. Green's sighting by, the stairs, the vicar's hint of anger, it all built the truth. Miss Marple knew how to listen, how to ask without seeming to. She was soft, like a breeze, but her questions were sharp, cutting through lies. The village trusted her, not because she pushed, but because she was kind, like a friend who always cared. Craddock was a good policeman, but he needed a light. The note was her way of shining it, without taking the stage. She didn't want praise, just justice. The blood, the knife, the nick, it all came from that shadow, a flicker she'd seen and never forgotten. The village mourned Miss Vane, then moved on. The hall stood quiet, the mirror reflecting nothing but dust. Tom was gone, locked away, his anger, his ruin. St. Mary Mead went back to its gentle ways, but Miss Marple stayed watchful. She sat by her window, her needles clicking, ready for the next clue, the next secret, the next shadow in the mirror. Miss Marple's genius lay not in grand gestures, but in the tiniest details. A scuff, a teacup, a shadow. Each clue, missed by others, was a thread she wove into justice. St. Mary Mead remained peaceful, its secrets safe with her, as she sat by her window, watching the world and its hidden truths unfold.